President Trump tells Fox News about Iran, "We are going to beat the effing S out of them." He went on to say, "We'll be hitting them hard. They're going to get a beating." So clearly the United States is going to respond to what the president described as a surprise attack. He says U.S. forces had just minutes to shoot down these incoming Iranian ballistic missiles.
Well, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps has carried out a surprise strike against the United States Air Base in Jordan, which really does mark the first time Iran has decided to carry out an offensive attack against a US base. Now, when it comes to surprise attacks, as we know, the United States certainly specializes in that. But in this case, it was the Iranians who decided to escalate the situation following news that Donald Trump had decided to pause bombing Iran due to the fact that we're running low on interceptor missiles. So news hits that Trump was convinced to stop bombing because of the interceptor missile situation. That is a vulnerability that Trump knew about a year in advance, by the way, and I'm gonna prove that by providing the receipts in just a bit. We should have never started the war, but now it appears Iran has us cornered because of the lack of military capabilities necessary to effectively respond for a prolonged period of time. We should have never entered this war. Let's be very clear about that. Now, it is likely that Iran is willing to gamble on this escalation due to the fact that Trump continues to make all sorts of unhinged threats against Iran's civilian infrastructure. And then he likes to couple that with the reality that we're low on missile interceptors. How is that a smart thing to do as the leader of this country? It's not, it's a dumb thing to do. But something tells me that we're in for a long series of dumb things Trump likes to do. So earlier Wednesday, Iran said it had targeted a US base in Jordan in response to aggressive actions by the US military, and Jordan said its air defenses intercepted 5 Iranian missiles. Now, Trump said that the US only had minutes to respond and be able to intercept those attacks from the Iranians. But nonetheless, as you heard in the video earlier, Donald Trump did in fact say that there will be a response, there will be retaliation. And of course, he used the foul language in order to send that message to the Iranians. Now, the New York Times reported that just last week, hundreds of Jordanian political, legal, and other figures actually signed this open letter to their government, and they're trying to send a message to the United States as well. This was a letter that they signed last week. So this is prior to the latest escalation featuring Iran doing a surprise strike on a US military base in Jordan. But the reason why they put this letter out is because unlike the Jordanian government, the people of Jordan want the United States out of their country. And I don't begrudge them for wanting that. I would want that as well, because simply hosting US military bases in your country, especially if you happen to be in the Middle East, essentially ends up making you a target. It'll drag your country into a war that they shouldn't be involved in. And that's what the people of Jordan, at least when it comes to this letter, are trying to communicate here. So this is a rare rebuke and public challenge to the Jordanian government. And I just want to give you a quick excerpt of it where they say, quote, "We maintain that their presence exposes Jordan to security, political, and economic risks that serve no national interest and increases the likelihood of our country being dragged into a regional conflict to which it is not a party." Something tells me that our Gulf allies certainly feel the same way. At least the people living in those countries feel the same way. And I've been saying for quite some time now that the governments or the leadership in these countries are in no way indicative of how the people of these countries feel about Israel or about hosting US military bases. Now, the presence of US forces and these bases has basically exposed the Jordanians to danger, including, by the way, debris falling from Iranian missiles that are intercepted. There's all sorts of material that ends up dropping from the sky. And I think there's this big misconception that, well, as long as the missiles are intercepted, everything's good. No, and by the way, these are missiles that are being intercepted on behalf of Israel because that's where the missiles are going. So they get intercepted above Jordan's territory. And then you have, all of the material from that interception falling onto the heads of the Jordanian people, and that's dangerous. So that's like best case scenario if they continue hosting a US airbase in Jordan. Now, it does look like Trump has already made good on his promise to retaliate against Iran, but Iran has responded to that retaliation. So at least when it comes to Iranian-backed groups through the region, it looks like Trump has targeted them for now. And what do I mean by that? Well, this is actually a huge escalation as it pertains to Saudi Arabia, because after Iran carried out a surprise attack on that US airbase in Jordan, the United States and Saudi Arabia actually carried out joint strikes targeting Iranian-backed forces in Iraq. Yeah, you heard that right, Iraq. Saudi Arabia has been doing whatever it can to just stay out of all of this. They want to de-escalate, but now they have chosen to enter the war, carrying out joint strikes alongside the United States against Iranian-backed groups in where? In Iraq. Okay, so we're back in Iraq. How fun. Now, this does mark the first time that Saudi Arabia has entered this war, US Central Command, and they haven't been as forthright with us in some ways. So I just want to be clear about that. This is fog of war type stuff, and I want you to be careful with what you believe and what you disbelieve. But this is what they're saying. US Central Command said in a statement that the two militaries hit logistics and weapon sites across eastern Iraq in response to more than 30 drone attacks directed by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in recent days. A US official said that Tuesday night's US-Saudi strikes in Iraq had killed about 20 Iranian advisors, a combination of members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and technical advisors, the official said, speaking on condition of anonymity. Now, the sites in Iraq were allegedly deliberately targeted for that reason, as well as to knock out the ability of Iran-backed militias to launch missiles and drones. So unclear whether or not they actually succeeded in doing away with that capability from Iraq's territory. But the entire global community, let's not make any mistake about this, is already suffering severe consequences for this incredibly stupid war that President Trump decided to carry out against Iran beginning on February 28th at the behest of Israel. And what do I mean by that? Well, already we know that oil and gas infrastructure in the Gulf has been targeted and destroyed. We already know that the Strait of Hormuz has been blocked. We already know that the Houthis are now carrying out strikes in the Red Sea and have effectively blocked the Bab al-Mandab Strait, and they're targeting specifically Saudi vessels that are attempting to transit, in that area and transport fuel. So that's going to have a negative impact on the economy, and it's certainly going to limit the supply of oil and liquefied natural gas. And so the latest on that, by the way, is that two ships, one of them a US-owned gas storage tanker, caught fire after an explosion at a shipping hub on Wednesday in Egypt, according to Kepler, a maritime tracking firm. I just love the way our media here in the United States frames things. It caught fire after an explosion. Oh, really? Okay, was it bombed? Like, what happened here? Now, to be fair, at the time of this reporting, first of all, the good news is that there were no injuries or deaths. That's the good news. But at the time of the reporting, I guess the New York Times didn't feel like they had the appropriate or sufficient confirmation of what actually happened to those tankers in order to claim that it was hit by a drone. But President Trump spoke to reporters in the Oval Office and said that an attack on Iran was coming in response to their attack on a US-owned liquefied natural gas carrier in Egypt. He said that he had been briefed and that, quote, "We're going to be hitting them very hard because it's our turn to hit them." I know you're going to hit them very hard. We've heard that over and over and over again. Unclear what that would accomplish. But the latest escalation involving Saudi Arabia could mean that the Saudis might soon allow the United States to use their bases to directly attack Iran. Now, the Saudi defense minister spoke to Axios, had a meeting with Vice President J.D. Vance, and the current reporting, and take it with a grain of salt because it is reported by Barak Ravid over at Axios. His reporting indicates that the Saudis do not want to escalate. They would like to de-escalate. But here's the thing. You don't say that you want to de-escalate when you just carried out joint strikes with the United States against Iranian-backed militia groups in Iraq, you know? So that being said, anyone who's maybe celebrating the notion that, the Saudis might allow the United States to use their land, their bases in order to directly strike Iran, we still have a big problem here. And that big problem is the fact that we've still depleted our missile interceptors. So what good does that do us if we do not have the capacity to shoot down missiles that are directed at our military, at our soldiers, at our military bases? How does that make any sense? So let's talk about the reality of the missile interceptors, because there's one expert that I listened to who, had a theory that kind of worried me a little bit. And the theory was, no. The US government is actually lying about the fact that their missile interceptors have been depleted. They're doing that in order to trick the Iranians, but that's not true. And the reason why I know that's not true is because our military was already low on missile interceptors well before Trump decided to launch the Iran war on February 28th. How do I know that? Well, there's one thing that Congress does do. They don't really pass laws or regulations or anything, any policy that benefits our lives, but they do love to have kabuki theater hearings. And one of those hearings actually took place last year on June 8th, featuring Army Secretary Daniel Driscoll. And the secretary actually addressed the very huge problem that we have with the depletion of missile interceptors during that Senate Armed Services Committee hearing. Let's take a quick look at that.
President Trump recently said we need to take a long, hard look at defense procurement and our defense industrial base because it's been withering down to nothing. Given all the money we spend on the Pentagon, it's unacceptable that we would ever run out of ammunition or be unable to quickly produce the weapons we need. You also acknowledged our munitions crisis at your confirmation hearing. You said one of the greatest problems facing our time is getting our munitions and getting our magazines back up to where they need to be. I assume 3 months on to the job, you still believe that addressing the nation's munitions crisis is vital if we are to deter and, if necessary, fight and win a war against China?
Absolutely, Senator. And I would even update and say it is, after 100 days of seeing it, it is worse than I thought at my confirmation hearing.
I think we've also learned pretty definitively over the last 3 years of the Ukraine war that our commercial industrial base, while vital, simply doesn't have the capacity to produce all the munitions that our nation needs and that our allies need, much less what we would need in a major conflict.
So that was Senator Tom Cotton. And if you paid close attention, in the beginning of that video, Tom Cotton makes reference to President Donald Trump being concerned about our munitions crisis. That hearing was on June 8th, 2025. Yet he still decided a year later, not even a year later, less than a year later. So this is June 2025. By February of 2026, knowing that we had depleted our interceptors, President Donald Trump decides to go to war with Iran. How does that make any sense? How does that make any sense? It doesn't. Which, by the way, brings me to Ukraine and the incredibly stupid gamble that they just engaged in. And I'm going to keep calling it stupid because that's what it is. So this all makes Ukraine's decision to strike an Iranian vessel in the Caspian Sea earlier this week, which some experts, by the way, believe they're doing in an attempt to merge the wars. So deeply moronic. Now, look, I know that there are people in the audience who have a great deal of sympathy for the Ukrainians. And so, by the way, I do also have great sympathy for Ukrainian civilians. But we got to call a spade when it comes to Zelensky and how deeply irresponsible he is. Because some of you were like, no, man, Ukraine's got the interceptors. They've got the interceptors. They're better than the interceptors the US makes. Do they? Do they? Because get a load of this. Zelensky to Axios. Ukraine needs missile interceptors to head off winter disaster. Now, usually I take Barack Ravid's reporting with a grain of salt, but in this case, Zelensky literally had an interview with Axios. So we got a sense of what's actually taking place with this ongoing war in Ukraine. So Zelensky met with Trump yesterday, as we shared with you all, and he asked him for an emergency winter package. Okay, the emergency winter package, ladies, is not what you think it is. Okay, it's nothing fun. So the winter package is of Patriot air defense interceptors to thwart Russian attacks. As Axios notes, the war with Iran has also drawn down US stockpiles of Patriot interceptors, making it difficult to sell them to Ukraine. Not making it difficult, Barack, okay? Making it impossible to sell them to Ukraine. We don't even have enough interceptors for our own stupid war against Iran. So impossible is the right word, impossible. But he further writes that Zelensky said Trump agreed during their Tuesday meeting to move ahead with the Patriot production licenses. Okay, so that would allow for Ukraine to build their own missile interceptors. After his White House visit, Zelensky said he met with representatives of Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, both of which produce Patriot interceptors, to discuss the issue. Okay, great. If they're gonna get the license, then everything's gonna be okay. Except it's not, because as I've been repeatedly saying on this show over and over again, even if Ukraine obtains the licenses, it would take 1 to 5 years to produce large sums of interceptors. Zelensky is apparently pissed because he says that timeline just doesn't work for me. It doesn't matter if that timeline doesn't work for you. The facts are the facts, and you have to have an understanding of what the munitions crisis is, how long it takes to build interceptors. But unfortunately, we're living in a world where various countries are being led by morons. So he wants 300 missile interceptors by winter, 300. And he says, we need the Patriots yesterday. You know, I need to look like a supermodel, but guess what? That's not gonna happen, okay? You gotta face reality. So look, the reason why I bring this up is because, again, deciding to enter the war against Iran by striking an Iranian vessel in the Caspian Sea was a really stupid move. And I just want people to validate that point of view because it's the accurate point of view. So we'll see where this all goes, but all signs point to more escalation. All signs point to a global energy crisis. All signs point to devastating inflation. And there's no end in sight. But the Israelis certainly are happy, aren't they? We gotta take a break. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit about that hearing featuring Anthony Fauci today. It is disturbing to say the least, so don't miss it. What's up, everybody? Welcome to our first social break of the day. We've got Crazy Lit Asian who says dead senators Lindsey Graham with his constant warmongering and John McCain with his bomb Iran song are still affecting us beyond the grave. I mean, I don't think so. I think the problem is we still have so many people who think the way Lindsey Graham thought in Congress right now, and we need to get them out. It's that simple. Although it's not simple, it's actually very difficult, as we've learned through, all the weaselly ways and corrupt ways that these primary elections play out. Progressive Entropy in our Twitch community says the war is growing and more countries are getting drawn in. This is not looking good, folks. I mean, obviously, I agree with you 100%. John Mearsheimer makes this point repeatedly, and I think it's the best point, and it's a good general point as it pertains to wars, whether you start them or not. It's easy to start a war. It is very difficult to exit a war. And that's what we're finding ourselves in today. What Trump did to Venezuela wasn't a war. He kidnapped, he made a deal, okay, with members of the Venezuelan government in order to allow for an operation that would allow for us to essentially kidnap Nicolas Maduro. That's not a war. What Trump started on February 28th is a war against a country that our government has consistently underestimated. I think it's the best word, totally underestimated. So Trump just underestimated them way worse than previous administrations.
Every time you ring the bell below, an angel gets his wings. Totally not true, but it does keep you updated on our live shows.